April 17, 1945, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The dental chair gleamed under fluorescent lights, a monstrous contraption of chrome and leather that seemed designed for something between surgery and inquisition. Obergefreiter Klaus Steiner, 23 years old, veteran of the Afrika Korps, survivor of Alamein and the Tunisian collapse, sat rigid in its grip. His hands, which had remained steady while loading an 80-toll-bladed anti-tank gun under British artillery fire, now trembled against the armrests. The American dentist, a captain, gray-haired, methodical, adjusted a lamp. The light was impossibly bright, clean. Nothing like the dim surgery tent Steiner remembered from North Africa, where the sanitator worked by kerosene lantern, and the only cure for a bad tooth was a pair of pliers and a shot of schnapps if you were lucky. "Open wide," the captain said in accented but competent German. Steiner had prepared himself for extraction. That was all he'd ever known. Pain, pressure, the sickening crack of a molar giving way, blood and gauze. His left side had 3 gaps where teeth used to be, removed by a field medic outside Tobruk in 1942, casualties of desert warfare and German military pragmatism. He expected the Americans, for all their wealth and power, to follow the same logic. Why waste resources on a prisoner's mouth? The dentist probed with a small mirror, tapped gently with a metal instrument, made notes on a clipboard. "You have 2 cavities," he announced. "We'll fill them. Also, I see you're missing several molars. We can fit you for a partial denture if you'd like." Steiner's eyes widened. His English was limited, but he understood the German translation from the medical orderly standing nearby. Fill them? Not pull them? And dentures, artificial teeth, for a prisoner. "This will last you many years," the dentist continued, preparing a syringe of Novocaine. "These fillings, if you take care of them, they'll last forever, or near enough." The needle entered his gum. Steiner barely felt it. Within minutes, his jaw went blissfully numb. He heard the high whine of the drill. An electric drill, not the foot pedal contraptions he'd glimpsed in German military hospitals. The procedure took 40 minutes. There was no pain, only pressure. The smell of burning enamel mixing with something metallic and clean. When it was over, the dentist held up a mirror. 2 silver fillings gleamed in Steiner's mouth like small declarations of something he couldn't yet name. "These fillings last forever," the captain repeated, patting Steiner's shoulder with the casual confidence of a man who had unlimited silver amalgam, unlimited electricity, unlimited time. "Take care of them." Steiner touched his tongue to the smooth metal. Solid, professional, perfect. For the first time since his capture, the full weight of Germany's defeat became real, not through military statistics or battlefield losses, not through the news of Berlin's fall or Hitler's death. It became real in his mouth, in the casual abundance of resources spent on an enemy soldier's dental health, in the American assumption that prisoners deserved to keep their teeth. That night in the barracks, Steiner ran his tongue over the fillings again and again, solid, permanent. Built to outlast the war, outlast his imprisonment, outlast perhaps even Steiner himself. They were still there 50 years later when he told his grandson this story in a Stuttgart apartment, an old man touching his jaw with wonder, remembering the day he understood that Germany had lost not just a war, but a contest of civilization so unequal that even its prisoners received luxury that German soldiers could only dream of. "These fillings last forever," he whispered to his grandson, who couldn't understand what those words had meant in 1945, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why a simple dental procedure became a revelation, why it shattered assumptions and redrew mental maps for thousands of Axis prisoners, we must go back further. Back to where these men came from, back to what they expected, back to the world they knew before they encountered the casual, almost careless abundance of American dentistry in the midst of total war. In the spring of 1939, in a small village outside Dresden, 18-year-old Klaus Steiner experienced his first and only visit to a dentist. Not because his teeth were particularly good, they weren't, but because dentistry for the rural working class of Germany was a luxury reserved for emergencies. And even then, the emergency had only one solution. The dentist, Herr Vogel, operated from a converted storefront that smelled of carbolic acid and fear. He was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one, shaped by the economics of interwar Germany, where supplies were scarce and time was money. Young Steiner, writhing with an abscessed molar that had kept him awake for 3 nights, sat in a worn leather chair that had probably been old during the Kaiser's time. Herr Vogel examined the tooth briefly. "It has to come out," he announced. No discussion of alternatives, no mention of fillings or root canals. Just the inevitable conclusion that teeth, like so many things in working-class German life, were temporary. The extraction took 7 minutes. No anesthetic. That cost extra, and the Steiner family couldn't afford extra. Klaus gripped the armrests while his mother held his hand, and Herr Vogel applied leverage with medieval determination. The tooth came out with a sound Klaus would never forget, followed by the copper taste of blood and the dentist's matter-of-fact instruction to bite down on a wad of cotton. 20 pfennigs, Herr Vogel said to Klaus's mother. She paid from a small cloth purse, counted the coins twice. 20 pfennigs represented half a day's wages for Klaus's father, a factory worker. For this price they had purchased the removal of pain, nothing more. The gap in Klaus's mouth would remain for the rest of his life, a small absence he learned to work around, shifting his chewing to the other side, avoiding hard foods. This was normal. This was what dentistry meant for millions of Germans, Japanese, Italians, for most of the world, really, outside the narrow corridors of wealth and privilege. Dentistry was subtraction, not preservation. You lost teeth the way you lost other things. Gradually, inevitably, with the understanding that what was gone forever. By 1941, when Steiner joined the Wehrmacht and shipped to North Africa with the Afrika Korps, he had lost 2 more teeth, one to another abscess that went untreated for months during his labor service year. Another knocked out during basic training when a rifle butt caught him wrong during a drill. The gaps in his smile marked him as working class, as surely as his Saxon accent. In the Afrika Korps, dental care existed in theory. The Wehrmacht had regulations, procedures, medical protocols. In practice, in the desert wastes of Libya and Egypt, the Sanitator, the medical corpsmen, carried dental forceps alongside their morphine and bandages. When soldiers complained of tooth pain, the solution remained the same as in Herr Vogel's Dresden storefront: extraction. Steiner remembered watching a fellow soldier, a Berliner named Rolf, lose a tooth outside Tobruk in July 1942. The heat that day reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Flies swarmed everything. The Sanitator, a former veterinary student from Munich, performed the extraction in the shadow of a disabled Panzer, using the same forceps he'd used on 3 other men that week. No sterilization beyond a quick wipe with a dirty cloth. No anesthetic. The morphine was reserved for the truly wounded, the men with shrapnel in their guts and bullets in their lungs. Rolf screamed. The tooth didn't want to come. It took the Sanitator 4 attempts, each one more violent than the last, before the molar finally gave way. Rolf spat blood into the sand, where it dried instantly in the African heat. He was back on duty the next day, jaw swollen, fever building, but still functional. The Wehrmacht didn't pause for toothaches. "At least it's out," Rolf said that evening, words slurred by swelling. "At least the pain will stop." It did stop, eventually. But the infection that followed nearly killed him. He survived, but 3 more teeth had to come out over the following months, casualties of the original botched extraction. By the time the Afrika Korps surrendered at Tunisia in May 1943, Rolf was missing half his teeth. He was 24 years old. For the Japanese soldiers who would later populate American POW camps, the situation was even more stark. Traditional Japanese dentistry had evolved differently from its Western counterpart, emphasizing prevention through diet and oral hygiene rather than intervention. But in the Imperial Japanese Army of World War II, even these traditions had broken down under the pressures of total war. Sergeant Takeshi Nakamura, captured at Okinawa in 1945, came from a farming family in rural Kyushu. His entire childhood experience with dental care consisted of his grandmother's folk remedies: saltwater rinses, certain herbs chewed to prevent tooth decay, the occasional application of ground cloves for pain. The first time he saw actual dentist, a military dentist in Osaka during his induction into the Army in 1943, the man spent approximately 90 seconds looking in his mouth before pronouncing him fit for service. "Your teeth are adequate," the dentist said. That was the extent of the examination. No cleaning, no x-rays, no discussion of the two visible cavities that would, over the next year, grow deeper and more painful. In the Pacific Island garrisons where Nakamura served, dental care was a fantasy. The Imperial Japanese Army's medical supplies, never adequate even at the war's beginning, had deteriorated to catastrophic levels by 1944. When Nakamura's tooth pain became unbearable, a molar had cracked while eating the dry rice that constituted their rations. He went to the unit's medical officer, a man who had been a dermatologist in civilian life and whose surgical experience consisted of what he'd learned from a manual. The officer looked at the tooth with evident distaste. "It should be removed," he said. But they had no proper instruments. Instead, the officer gave Nakamura a bottle of weak sake and told him to drink until the pain diminished. "We'll extract it when we have proper tools," he promised. The tools never came. Nakamura lived with the pain for 8 months, until the night of April 15, 1945, when the tooth finally abscessed so badly that the officer had no choice. Using a pair of ordinary pliers from a tool kit, sterilized by holding them in a candle flame, the officer extracted the tooth while 2 soldiers held Nakamura down. The procedure took 20 minutes. Nakamura passed out twice from the pain. "Be grateful," the officer told him afterwards. "In the old army, they would have let you die rather than waste time on a tooth." Nakamura, spitting blood and pieces of his jaw, nodded. He was grateful. This was the mathematics of survival in the Imperial Japanese Army in 1945. You were grateful for any attention at all. The German experience, while somewhat better, still operated under fundamentally different assumptions than what awaited these men in American captivity. Even in the Wehrmacht's better supplied units in Europe, dental care remained reactive and minimal. Lieutenant Heinrich Becker, captured during the Battle of the Bulge in January 1945, came from an educated middle-class family in Hamburg. His father was a professor, his mother a physician. He had actually received what passed for good dental care in Germany: regular checkups, several fillings, treatment for minor issues. But even these fillings, done in Hamburg's better clinics, were temporary affairs. German wartime dentistry, like everything else in the Reich by 1944, had been forced to adapt to scarcity. The silver and gold that had once been standard for fillings had been requisitioned for the war effort. Instead, dentists used ersatz materials, cement fillings that lasted months if you were lucky, temporary treatments that needed constant replacement, make-do solutions that reflected Germany's increasingly desperate resource situation. Becker's pre-war fillings, done with actual amalgam, had been a source of minor pride, but by 1944, when one of them fell out during his service on the Eastern Front, the replacement was a cement plug that the regimental dentist admitted would probably last a few months, maybe a year if you're careful. "After the war, you can have it done properly," the dentist said, already preparing for the next patient in line. There were always more patients than time, more problems than solutions. For now, this will keep the pain away. It did, mostly. The cement filling lasted 6 months before crumbling. Becker learned to chew on the other side of his mouth, to avoid hot and cold foods, to live with the low-grade discomfort that seemed, in the context of the war's final catastrophic year, like the least of anyone's problems. When he was captured by American forces in the Ardennes forest, shivering in a foxhole with 3 other survivors of his company, one of his first coherent thoughts, after the relief of survival, after the shock of surrender, was about his teeth. How much worse would they get in a prisoner of war camp? How long before he lost them entirely? He had no framework for imagining what would actually happen. None of them did. The first time Obergefreiter Klaus Steiner entered an American military dentist's office was not at Camp Ruston in Louisiana. It was 2 days after his capture in Tunisia, in a field processing center near the coast where thousands of Afrika Korps prisoners were being documented, photographed, deloused, and given initial medical examinations. The medical exam itself had been startling enough. American medics, young men who seemed impossibly clean and well-fed, checked each prisoner systematically. They looked for wounds, diseases, malnutrition. They administered typhus vaccines. They gave Steiner his first injection of penicillin for an infected cut on his arm, a cut he'd been living with for 2 weeks and assumed would either heal on its own or kill him. The penicillin fascinated him. He'd heard rumors of this wonder drug, this American miracle that could stop infections that would have required amputation or resulted in death. Receiving it himself as a prisoner seemed impossible. Why waste such precious medicine on captured enemies? But the Americans did. They did so casually, almost carelessly, as if penicillin were as common as aspirin. The medic who administered the injection chatted with a colleague about a baseball game while the needle went in. No ceremony, no sense of the precious resource being expended, just routine. "Next, dental," someone announced in German. Steiner, along with 50 other prisoners, was herded into a large tent. Inside, 3 dental chairs had been set up, real dental chairs, transported presumably from America or assembled from supplies, complex pieces of equipment that spoke to logistics and planning on a scale Steiner was only beginning to comprehend. A corpsman with a clipboard went down the line, asking questions in broken German. Had they experienced tooth pain recently? Were any teeth loose? When was their last dental examination? Most men, Steiner included, couldn't remember their last dental exam. For most, it had been their pre-induction physical years ago, which had consisted of a doctor glancing in their mouths for 30 seconds. Actual dental care, the kind this questionnaire seemed to assume, was so far outside their experience that many didn't understand the questions. "We're going to do x-rays," the corpsman explained. "Routine procedure, then the dentist will examine you and schedule any necessary work." X-rays. Steiner had heard of X-rays, of course. They were hardly new technology in 1943. But the idea of X-raying prisoners' teeth, of investing the time and resources for such diagnostic precision, seemed absurd. What would they possibly gain from such information? Why did they care? The X-ray itself took 3 minutes. Steiner bit down on a small piece of film while a machine whirred and clicked. No pain, no discomfort. Just technology applied with the same casual abundance as the penicillin. 2 hours later, he stood before an American Army dentist, a major, middle-aged, competent-looking, who was studying the X-ray with professional interest. "You have significant decay in 3 molars," the major said through an interpreter. "We'll need to do fillings. Also, I see you're missing teeth here, here, and here." He pointed to the gaps in Steiner's mouth. "We can fit you for a bridge, or partial dentures, if you prefer." Steiner stared. The interpreter repeated the statement, thinking perhaps Steiner hadn't understood. But he had understood. He simply couldn't believe it. "You're going to fill my teeth?" he asked. "Not extract them?" The major looked puzzled. "Why would we extract them? They can be saved. Extraction is a last resort." The interpreter translated. The major nodded, made a note on the chart. "We'll schedule you for next week," he said. "Right now, we're prioritizing acute cases, men with infections or severe pain. Your cavities are significant but not emergency level." Any questions? Steiner had 1,000 questions, but none he could articulate. The entire interaction had lasted maybe 5 minutes. The major was already looking at the next prisoner's X-ray. To him, this was routine, standard procedure, nothing remarkable about planning extensive dental work on enemy prisoners. That night, in the prisoner barracks, Steiner tried to explain the encounter to his fellow captives. Many didn't believe him. "They'll extract them," said Rolf, the Berliner who'd lost half his teeth in Africa. "This is just American efficiency. They're documenting everyone so they know what needs to be pulled when it becomes necessary." "No," Steiner insisted. "They said fillings. They said they want to save the teeth." "Why?" another soldier asked. The question hung in the air. Why indeed? Why would captors invest resources in preserving their enemies' teeth? What possible strategic or even humanitarian logic supported such a decision? None of them had an answer. They fell asleep that night in clean barracks, on actual cots with clean blankets, having eaten their first full meal in weeks, another impossibility they were still processing. The dental care was just one more piece of a puzzle that didn't fit any of their preconceptions about war, captivity, or America. The pattern repeated itself across every American POW camp that held Axis prisoners. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, Camp Como in Mississippi, Camp Shanks in New York, and dozens of other facilities, captured German, Italian, and Japanese soldiers received the same bewildering introduction to American military dentistry. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Private First Class Giuseppe Rossi, late of the Italian 132nd Armored Division, captured in Sicily, experienced his first dental appointment in March 1944. Rossi, a 20-year-old from rural Calabria, had never seen a dentist before in his life, not once. His teeth, predictably, were in catastrophic condition: 9 cavities, 4 missing molars, significant gum disease. The American dentist, a captain from Philadelphia, looked at the x-rays and whistled softly. "We've got our work cut out for us," he told his assistant. To Rossi, through an interpreter, "This is going to take several sessions. We'll start with the worst cavities, then address the gum disease, then talk about replacements for the missing teeth." Several sessions. The phrase made no sense to Rossi. In his village, you went to the barber surgeon when a tooth was so bad you couldn't function, and he pulled it out. One session. One terrible session, and then it was over. The idea of multiple appointments, of a treatment plan spanning weeks or months, belonged to a different universe. "Why?" Rossi asked through the interpreter. Not defiant, just genuinely confused. "Why do all this?" The captain paused in his preparations. It was a question he'd heard before from Italian and German prisoners, and it always gave him pause. How to explain? How to articulate something so basic to American medical practice that it hardly seemed to need explanation? "Because you're going to need those teeth for the rest of your life," he said finally. "Better to fix them now than let them rot. It's cheaper in the long run, actually. Prevention and early intervention cost less than dealing with serious problems later," the interpreter translated. Rossi absorbed this. The logic was impeccable, but it was a logic that assumed resources, planning, long-term thinking. It was a logic that assumed a prisoner's long run mattered enough to invest in. In fascist Italy and the Italian army, such assumptions would have been laughable. Resources went to winning the war, not to maintaining enemy prisoners' dental health. That the Americans could do both, prosecute a global war and provide comprehensive dental care to prisoners, suggested something about American power that was more disturbing than any battlefield defeat. Over the next 2 months, Rossi sat through 7 dental appointments. The American dentist filled his cavities with silver amalgam that gleamed in his mouth. He treated the gum disease with cleanings and antibiotics. He fitted Rossi with a partial denture to replace the missing molars, an actual prosthetic, custom-made, that fit perfectly and allowed him to chew normally for the first time in 3 years. The cost in materials and labor must have been significant. Rossi tried to calculate it in Liar, but gave up. The numbers were too large, too abstract. The Americans were spending more on his mouth than the Italian army had spent on feeding him for the entire year before his capture. "How does it feel?" the dentist asked when the work was finally complete. Rossi ran his tongue over the smooth fillings, clicked the denture into place, smiled tentatively. "Strange," he admitted. Then, searching for words, "Good strange. Thank you." The dentist nodded, made a final note in Rossi's chart. "Take care of them," he said. "They should last you decades if you do." Decades. Another assumption, that Rossi had decades ahead of him, that he would return to Italy someday, that he would live a normal lifespan during which his dental work would remain relevant. Such assumptions, such casual planning for futures that included Italian prisoners living long lives, were almost more disorienting than the dental work itself. For Japanese prisoners, the experience carried additional layers of cultural shock. The Bushido Code, however distorted by militarism, emphasized stoic acceptance of suffering. Dental pain, like all pain, was something to be endured silently, proof of one's inner strength and discipline. The idea of seeking treatment, much less having it provided by your captors, contradicted everything they'd been taught about proper conduct in war. Sergeant Takeshi Nakamura, transferred to a POW camp in California after his capture at Okinawa, sat in the dental chair with the rigid posture of a man prepared for torture. The American dentist, a young lieutenant, friendly and professional, saw the tension and understood its source. "We're going to give you something for the pain," he explained through a Nisei interpreter. "You won't feel anything during the procedure." Nakamura shook his head. "No need," he said in halting English. "I can endure." The dentist smiled gently. "I'm sure you can, but there's no reason to. This is better for both of us. You'll be more comfortable and I can work more efficiently. It's standard procedure." Standard procedure. The Americans had standard procedures for everything, including sparing their prisoners pain. Nakamura finally accepted the Novocaine, more from confusion than conviction. The numbness that spread through his jaw was unlike anything he'd experienced. Not unconsciousness, not pain suppressed through willpower, but actual absence of pain. Chemical intervention that made suffering optional. The dentist worked for 45 minutes, filling 3 cavities and extracting 1 tooth that was too far gone to save. Throughout, Nakamura felt pressure but no pain. The dentist hummed while he worked, hummed as if this were a pleasant afternoon task rather than treatment of an enemy soldier. When it was over, the dentist held up a mirror. "See? Good as new. Well, mostly. That molar couldn't be saved, but the others should be fine now." Nakamura looked at the reflection of his mouth. The silver fillings gleamed. The extraction site had been cleaned and sutured with neat, precise stitches. It was professional work, the kind he imagined wealthy Tokyo businessmen received from expensive private dentists. And he was a prisoner. An enemy combatant, a soldier of an army that had fought with fanatical brutality, that had shown little mercy to its prisoners, that had earned America's enmity through Pearl Harbor and Bataan and 1,000 other offenses. Yet here he sat in a clean clinic, having received dental care that exceeded anything he'd experienced as a free man in Japan. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How did you hate an enemy who fixed your teeth? How did you maintain the mental framework of us versus them when them had just spent resources and effort ensuring you could chew properly? The propaganda he'd absorbed about American brutality and callousness crumbled against the reality of that dental chair, that Novocaine, those careful sutures. That night, Nakamura wrote in the diary the camp allowed prisoners to keep. The entry was brief, factual, but underneath the neutral language lay a seismic shift in worldview. "Today I visited the American dentist. He filled 3 teeth and removed 1. There was no pain. The work was very professional. I do not understand these people." He would spend the next 47 years until his death in 1992, still trying to understand. The dental work lasted all that time. The fillings the American lieutenant had placed in 1945 were still intact when Nakamura died, small silver monuments to a generosity he'd never quite wrapped his mind around. To understand why American dental care shocked Axis prisoners so profoundly, we must understand the vast material and technological gulf that separated America from its enemies by 1943-1945. This gap manifested in every aspect of the war, from industrial production to military logistics. But perhaps nowhere was it more viscerally evident than in the mundane details of dental supplies. In 1944, the United States produced approximately 127,000 tons of silver for industrial and military use. A significant portion went to the Manhattan Project, but the military's dental corps also consumed thousands of tons for amalgam fillings. Silver amalgam, a mixture of silver, mercury, copper, and tin, was the gold standard, so to speak, of dental fillings, durable and long-lasting, capable of withstanding years of chewing and pressure. Germany, by contrast, was producing virtually no silver for dental use by 1944. What little precious metal the Reich still controlled went to weapons production, electronics, and other high-priority military applications. German dentists made do with zinc oxide cement fillings, temporary at best, prone to crumbling and failure, requiring constant replacement. By late 1944, even these inferior materials were in short supply. Some dentists resorted to medieval solutions, mixing sawdust with adhesive compounds, using beeswax as a temporary sealant, even applying simple cotton packing soaked in clove oil to cavities, not to fill them, but merely to deaden the pain. Japan's situation was even worse. The island nation had never had access to significant mineral resources, and by 1944, its supply lines were being systematically destroyed by American submarines. The Imperial Japanese Army's dental supplies, never adequate even in peacetime, had essentially disappeared. Japanese military dentists operated with pre-war stockpiles that dwindled to nothing, then improvised with whatever they could find. There are documented cases of Japanese dentists using melted coins to attempt fillings with about the success rate you'd expect. This wasn't mere scarcity. This was the difference between civilizations operating at fundamentally different levels of material abundance. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, Chief Dental Officer at Camp Ruston, kept meticulous records of supplies and procedures. His monthly reports paint a picture of almost absurd abundance. May 1945, silver amalgam used, 47 pounds, Novocaine doses administered, 1,247 x-rays taken, 892 fillings completed, 108 extractions performed, 127 primarily on teeth too damaged to save, dentures fitted, 43 sets, root canals, 67. These numbers represented treatment for approximately 2,300 German and Italian prisoners at that one camp. The 47 pounds of silver amalgam alone, used in a single month at a single facility on prisoners, exceeded what the entire German Wehrmacht Dental Corps had available for all its frontline units in the same period. Morrison noted in one report with evident bemusement, "The German prisoners seemed genuinely shocked by the quality of care provided. Several have expressed disbelief that we would waste silver on their teeth. I have explained that this is standard procedure, but the concept of preventive dental care seems foreign to most." Indeed it did. For men like Klaus Steiner, the realization came in stages. First, the shock of receiving care at all. Then, the quality of that care. Finally, the cumulative weight of understanding what such care implied about American resources and priorities. Consider, in 1944, an American military dentist's standard field kit contained an electric or foot-powered drill with multiple bits, 20-plus pounds of silver amalgam, sufficient Novocaine for hundreds of procedures, sterilization equipment and supplies, X-ray capability in fixed facilities, a complete set of extraction tools used only when absolutely necessary, denture-making supplies, root canal equipment, various acids, cements, and bonding agents. A German military dentist's field kit in the same period typically contained a hand-powered drill, if lucky, a few pounds of zinc oxide cement extraction tools, the primary solution, basic antiseptic, perhaps a small amount of local anesthetic, very rare by 1944. The disparity was so vast it became almost mathematical proof of German defeat. You could calculate the outcome of the war by comparing dental supply manifests. The technological gap was equally significant. American military dentistry in World War II benefited from decades of innovation and investment. The United States had professionalized dentistry early, establishing dental schools and research programs that continuously improved techniques and materials. By 1940, American dentistry was the most advanced in the world, with standardized procedures, quality materials, and a philosophical commitment to preservation rather than extraction. This philosophy permeated military dentistry. The U.S. Army Dental Corps, established in 1911, operated under principles that would have seemed alien to Axis medical personnel. Prevention is cheaper than treatment. Preservation is preferable to extraction. Dental health affects overall health and military readiness. All personnel, including prisoners under American care, deserve adequate dental treatment. That last point, extending quality care to prisoners, wasn't mere altruism. It was rooted in the Geneva Convention's requirements for humane treatment of POWs, yes, but it also reflected a characteristically American pragmatism. Healthy prisoners caused fewer problems, required less medical intervention for serious conditions, and could be more productively employed in work details that supported the war effort. The dental care was good policy as well as good ethics. But from the perspective of Axis prisoners, such reasoning was incomprehensible. They came from military cultures where privation was expected, where suffering was valorized, where resources flowed upward to officers and strategic priorities, never downward to enlisted men, or certainly not to prisoners. The idea that investing in prisoner dental health made economic sense required a worldview so abundant, so secure in its resource base, that inefficiency in the name of humanity became affordable. Private Giuseppe Rossi, the Italian prisoner at Camp McCoy, tried to explain this to his brother in a letter home after the war. In America, they throw away more food than we ate in a month. They have so much of everything, gasoline, steel, rubber, medicine, that they can afford to be generous even with prisoners. The dentist who fixed my teeth used silver. Silver. For a prisoner's fillings. In Italy, silver went to the officer's insignia, to the church's decorations, to anything considered important. American prisoners? They get silver fillings as standard procedure. This is why we lost, Enzo. Not because of superior tactics or braver soldiers. We lost because we fought a country that could afford to fill prisoners' teeth with silver and not even think twice about it. The letter, intercepted by Italian postal censors in 1947, made its way into intelligence files. Officials noted with some alarm that returning POWs were spreading similar observations, painting America as a land of impossible abundance that made European scarcity look like third world poverty, which in many ways it was. The war had exposed what the Depression and Europe's interwar chaos had obscured. The United States had developed into a different category of economy entirely, one where wartime production and civilian abundance existed simultaneously, where resources weren't zero-sum, where you could fight a global war on two fronts and provide comprehensive dental care to thousands of enemy prisoners without breaking a sweat. The silver fillings became symbols of this reality. Small, mundane, literally embedded in prisoners' mouths, they were testimonies to a power that transcended military might. They suggested a civilization so wealthy, so organized, so fundamentally superior in its productive capacity that its casual byproducts exceeded its enemies' highest priorities. The transformation didn't happen instantly. Human beings don't abandon their worldviews overnight, especially worldviews reinforced by years of propaganda, military indoctrination, and national identity. But the dental work chipped away at these foundations in ways that direct propaganda never could. Consider Klaus Steiner's journey. After his initial dental work in Tunisia, he was transferred to the United States, ending up at Camp Ruston in Louisiana. The journey itself, by ship, well-fed, with adequate sanitation, no brutality, had already begun reshaping his assumptions, but it was the ongoing dental care that crystallized his transformation. In January 1945, one of his original fillings, the temporary cement work done by a Wehrmacht dentist in 1942, finally crumbled completely. Steiner reported to the camp dental clinic with familiar dread, expecting the American dentist would extract the tooth. Why wouldn't he? The tooth had lost its previous filling, probably had deep decay, and represented another drain on resources. The dentist, the same captain from his initial visit, examined the tooth carefully, took an X-ray, studied it under the bright lamp. "We can save it," he announced. "It'll need a root canal, though. That's a bit more involved than a filling." A root canal. Steiner had heard the term but didn't really know what it meant. The translator explained they would remove the infected pulp from inside the tooth, clean the canal, seal it, then crown it. The tooth would be dead but functional, capable of lasting decades. "This will take 2 appointments," the captain continued. "Today we'll do the root canal and put in a temporary filling. Next week we'll finish with the permanent crown." Steiner submitted to the procedure in a daze. The Novocaine injection, painless as always. The careful drilling, precise, controlled, nothing like the brutal efficiency of field dentistry. The captain worked for 90 minutes, chatting occasionally with his assistant about his children back home, about the weather, about anything except the fact that he was performing complex restorative dentistry on an enemy soldier. When it was over, Steiner touched his tongue to the tooth. It felt strange, numb from the Novocaine, but also somehow different. Dead, but preserved. Saved from extraction through American technical skill and resource abundance. "See you next week," the captain said cheerfully. That night, lying in his barracks bunk, Steiner tried to articulate what he was feeling. Not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. Not confusion. He was past mere confusion now. What he felt was a kind of ontological vertigo, a sense that the fundamental categories by which he'd understood the world were dissolving. He had been taught that Germany represented the pinnacle of civilization, that the Reich's enemies were degenerate, weak, incapable of the discipline and organization that made Germany great. He had believed this, more or less, even as the war turned against them. Defeats could be explained by numbers, by betrayal, by bad luck. But this casual abundance, this technological superiority, this willingness to invest enormous effort in preserving an enemy's teeth, couldn't be explained away. The Americans weren't weak. They weren't disorganized. They weren't anything the propaganda had claimed. They were so strong, so secure, so drowning in resources that they could afford to be humane without cost, generous without sacrifice. They could fight a global war with one hand and perform root canals on prisoners with the other. The realization was crushing. Not because Steiner had loved the Nazi regime. He'd been a soldier, not a true believer. But because it meant everything he'd assumed about his place in the world was wrong. Germany wasn't the master race. It was a second-rate power that had picked a fight with a first-rate economy and was now paying the price. The silver fillings in his mouth were proof, undeniable and permanent. This pattern of psychological transformation repeated itself thousands of times across American POW camps. The dental care wasn't alone in producing this effect. The food, the medical treatment, the general conditions all contributed. But the dental work had a unique power because it was so personal, so intimate, so literally embedded in one's body. Lieutenant Heinrich Becker, the educated Hamburg officer captured at the Bulge, underwent a similar evolution. His first appointment at Camp Shanks in New York came in March 1945. The dentist, a major from Chicago, examined Becker's mouth and made notes. "Your teeth aren't in terrible shape," he said. "You got some old fillings here that are failing. Looks like cement work. We'll replace those with amalgam. Also some minor decay that needs addressing." Over the next 2 months, Becker received 5 dental appointments. The cement fillings from German dentists were drilled out and replaced with silver amalgam. 2 new cavities were filled. His teeth were cleaned professionally, the first real cleaning since before the war. The final result was a mouth in better condition than it had been since his university days, but the process did more than fix his teeth. It forced Becker to confront uncomfortable truths about the system he'd served. Becker, unlike Steiner, had been a convinced National Socialist. Not fanatical, but convinced. He'd believed in German superiority, in the righteousness of the Reich's cause, in the necessity of the war. His education, his officer status, his family background had all reinforced these beliefs. Defeat on the battlefield he could accept. Wars were sometimes lost. But this was different. The dental care revealed something the battlefield couldn't. The Americans weren't defeating Germany through luck or numbers or outside help. They were defeating Germany because they operated at a fundamentally higher level of organization and productivity. The evidence was in his mouth. Each silver filling was a small monument to American industrial capacity. Each painless procedure was proof of American medical advancement. Each careful appointment was testament to American systematic efficiency. One day, while the dentist worked on replacing a cement filling, Becker asked a question. "How much does this cost? The materials? Your time? The equipment?" The dentist paused, considered. "For one filling? Materials are maybe $2. My time, I'm salaried, so that's harder to calculate. The equipment's already paid for. Let's say, all in, maybe $5 per filling. $5. Becker did rapid mental calculations. At the exchange rate, that was about 20 Reichsmarks, a working-class German's daily wage, and the Americans were spending this casually on prisoners, repeated thousands of times across dozens of camps. Why? Becker asked, not challenging, just genuinely wanting to understand. The dentist seemed to consider the question seriously. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally, but also because it's efficient. Healthy prisoners are easier to manage, less likely to develop serious medical problems, more productive if we put them to work. Penny wise, pound foolish. You know that expression? Becker nodded. He did. The dentist was articulating a philosophy of resource management that the Third Reich had never grasped, that investing in basic human welfare, even for prisoners, produced returns that justified the investment. The Reich had operated on opposite principles: extract maximum utility from human beings while investing minimal resources in their maintenance. It had seemed logical, even necessary, in the context of Germany's resource scarcity. But now Becker understood. The scarcity itself was the problem. Germany had been poor trying to act rich, weak trying to project strength. America was rich enough to be generous and still have resources left over for everything else. The dental care was just one small manifestation of a wealth gap so vast that generosity became practical policy. The war is over, Becker said quietly, not to the dentist, but to himself. He didn't mean the fighting. That would continue until May. He meant the contest between ideologies, between systems, between visions of how civilization should operate. That war was over, and Germany had lost before the first shot was fired, because it had built its 1,000-year Reich on foundations of scarcity, while America built its democracy on abundance. The dentist didn't hear him. He was focused on the filling, shaping the amalgam with practiced precision, building something meant to last decades. But Becker heard himself, and something inside him quietly collapsed, not painfully, but with a sense of inevitable conclusion. The Reich was finished, and perhaps that was for the best. For Japanese prisoners, the psychological transformation was even more wrenching. Their culture's emphasis on honor, discipline, and hierarchical respect meant that surrender itself was traumatic. Many expected execution or, at minimum, brutal treatment. Instead, they encountered American military bureaucracy at its most mundane: paperwork, medical examinations, dental appointments. Sergeant Takeshi Nakamura, after his initial dental work, found himself assigned to a work detail at a nearby farm. The prisoners were paid for their labor, actual money, though they couldn't spend it outside the camp, and treated with casual professionalism by their guards. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. At his follow-up dental appointment in July 1945, Nakamura asked the American dentist a question through the interpreter. In Japan, we were told Americans would torture prisoners. Why do you help us instead? The dentist, the same young lieutenant from before, looked surprised by the question. Why would we torture you? You're prisoners of war, not criminals. The Geneva Convention requires humane treatment. But also, honestly, it's just the decent thing to do. The decent thing to do. The phrase translated into Japanese carried implications that troubled Nakamura deeply. In the Imperial Japanese Army, decency was defined by one's duties within a rigid hierarchy. You showed respect to superiors, expected obedience from inferiors, and maintained discipline through strict adherence to protocol. Kindness to enemies, especially defeated enemies who had brought shame upon themselves through surrender, wasn't decent. It was weakness. Yet the Americans practiced this weakness systematically. They fed prisoners well. They provided medical care. They fixed their teeth. And somehow, despite this apparent weakness, they had crushed the Imperial Japanese military with overwhelming force. The paradox was maddening. Nakamura wrote in his diary that evening, "The Americans defeat us with kindness as thoroughly as with bombs. I do not know which is more devastating to the spirit. The bombs destroy the body." The kindness destroys everything we believed about strength and weakness, honor and shame. When I returned to Japan, how do I explain that the enemy fixed my teeth, that they treated me better than my own officers did, that their weakness proved stronger than our strength? He never did find satisfactory answers. After repatriation in 1946, Nakamura struggled to reintegrate into Japanese society. The silver fillings in his mouth became a source of quiet shame, proof that he'd survived when honorable death had been expected, proof that he'd accepted aid from the enemy. But they were also proof of something else, something harder to articulate, that the worldview he'd been raised with was fundamentally flawed, that strength and harshness weren't synonymous, that civilization might be measured not by military prowess, but by how a society treated its weakest members, even its enemies. By war's end, American military dentists had treated over 380,000 Axis prisoners held in camps across the United States. The statistics compiled by the Army Dental Corps paint a picture of systematic, comprehensive care. 847,000 fillings completed, 127,000 extractions performed, only when absolutely necessary. 23,000 sets of dentures fitted, 67,000 root canals performed, 2 in million dental examinations conducted. The silver amalgam alone consumed in these procedures amounted to over 14,000 pounds, roughly 7 tons of silver used to fill enemy prisoners' teeth. For comparison, the entire German Wehrmacht Dental Corps used an estimated 400 pounds of silver amalgam in 1944, and that was for their own soldiers, not prisoners. The economic implications were staggering. At 1945 prices, the American dental program for Axis prisoners cost approximately $18 million, roughly $270 million in 2025 dollars. This was for dental care alone, not including general medical treatment, food, housing, or any other aspect of prisoner management. Germany and Japan couldn't have afforded such expenditure even for their own troops, let alone for captured enemies. The resource differential revealed by these numbers was almost comical. The United States was spending more money on enemy prisoners' dental health than the Axis powers were spending on entire Army divisions. The physical evidence of this investment outlasted the war by decades. In the 1970s, a German researcher conducted a survey of former Wehrmacht soldiers who had been held in American POW camps. Among the questions, were the dental fillings received during captivity still intact? Of the 2,200 respondents who'd received dental work during captivity, 892, 74%, reported that their American fillings were still functional 30 years later. Many noted that these fillings had outlasted multiple subsequent dental procedures in post-war Germany. Klaus Steiner was one such respondent. In his survey reply, he wrote, "The fillings from Camp Ruston are still in my mouth. They have outlasted 2 German crowns, multiple fillings done in the 1950s and 60s, and my general health. My German dentist calls them eternal, better quality than anything he can do even now. When I die, these American fillings will probably survive the cremation. They will outlast me as they have outlasted the war, the Reich, and all the certainties I once had about the world." The poignancy of that statement reveals something essential about the POW dental experience. It wasn't just about fixing teeth. It was about confronting evidence, personal and irrefutable, of a civilization gap that no amount of propaganda could bridge. Giuseppe Rossi kept his American dentures for 43 years, until his death in 1988. His family reported that he maintained them meticulously, cleaning them every day with the kind of care he'd learned from American dental hygienists in Camp McCoy. He'd received 1 set of replacement dentures in 1967, but continued to keep the originals in a small box on his dresser. "Those teeth saved my life," he told his grandson in 1985. The grandson, a teenager with no memory of the war, didn't understand. "They're just teeth, Nono," he said. Rossi shook his head. "No, they are proof. Proof that I was wrong about Americans, wrong about what strength means, wrong about many things. When I was captured, I thought my life was over. The Americans gave me those teeth, and with them a future. They assumed I would live long enough to need teeth to eat properly, to be a normal human being. That assumption was the greatest gift. It meant I mattered, even as a prisoner, even as an enemy. It meant they believed in tomorrow for all of us, not just for themselves. He picked up the box containing the original dentures, yellowed now, but still intact. When they fitted these for me in 1944, they told me they would last 20 years if I cared for them. It's been 43 years. They outlasted their promise, just like America outlasted our cynicism about them. Takeshi Nakamura's relationship with his American dental work was more complicated. In post-war Japan, the silver fillings became a source of psychological discomfort. During the American occupation, they were acceptable. Many Japanese had received dental treatment from American military medical personnel. But after the occupation ended and Japanese national pride reasserted itself, Nakamura found himself reluctant to open his mouth widely in public. The silver gleam of American fillings felt like a confession, an advertisement of defeat and acceptance. Yet he never had them replaced. Japanese dentists in the 1950s and 60s offered to replace the American work with newer Japanese materials, but Nakamura always refused. When pressed by his wife about why, he struggled to explain. "They remind me of something important," he said finally. "Something I don't want to forget." What that something was, he never fully articulated, but in his diary, kept continuously from his Army days until a week before his death in 1992, certain themes recur. The danger of believing your own propaganda, the importance of treating enemies humanely, not from weakness, but from strength, the realization that civilization is measured not by what you do for your own people, but by what you do for others, especially those you have power over. His final diary entry, written in a shaky hand at age 68, returned to the dental chair one last time. "Tomorrow I go to the dentist. My Japanese dentist, Dr. Yamada, tells me one of the American fillings is finally failing after 47 years. He seems almost reluctant to remove it, as if he too recognizes these fillings as historical artifacts. When that American lieutenant worked on my teeth in 1945, he could not have imagined I would carry his work for nearly half a century. He probably doesn't remember me at all. I was just one prisoner among thousands. But I remember him. I remember his kindness, his professional competence, his casual assumption that an enemy's dental health mattered. That assumption changed me more than any battle ever did. Tomorrow, when Dr. Yamada removes the last American filling, a small era will end. But what it taught me will last until my own end, which cannot be far off now." Nakamura died 6 days later of natural causes. Dr. Yamada reported that he never did get to replace that filling. The PAO dental care program, while seemingly a minor footnote in World War II history, illuminated larger truths about the American way of war and the nature of American power. These truths resonated far beyond prisoner camps, shaping post-war reconstruction, international relations, and American strategic thinking for decades. First, the dental program exemplified American material abundance. The United States fought World War II without significant domestic sacrifice. There was rationing, yes, but nothing like the privation experienced in Europe or Asia. American civilians ate well, lived comfortably, and the economy actually grew during the war years. This abundance wasn't accidental. It reflected decades of industrial development, natural resource advantages, and a political economic system that, despite its flaws, generated wealth on an unprecedented scale. The dental care for prisoners was a byproduct of this abundance. America could afford to be generous because generosity cost almost nothing relative to total resources. The 7 tons of silver used for prisoner fillings represented a rounding error in American silver production. The dentists treating prisoners were using excess capacity, men and materials that would have sat idle otherwise. This casual abundance had profound psychological effects on Axis prisoners, effects that shaped their post-war politics and worldviews. Many returned home as informal ambassadors of American soft power, telling stories of treatment that contradicted their government's propaganda. In post-war Germany and Japan, these stories contributed to pro-American sentiment and support for alignment with the United States during the Cold War. Second, the program revealed American commitment to rules-based international order. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners, but it didn't specify dental care. Many nations provided minimal compliance, keeping prisoners alive and unharmed, but little more. America went beyond minimum requirements, not from legal obligation, but from cultural disposition. This pattern, exceeding international standards, voluntarily accepting higher burdens, using power not just for domination but for system building, became characteristic of American foreign policy in the post-war era. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt European economies including former enemies, followed the same logic as the POW dental program. Invest in generosity now, reap benefits later. Healthy teeth, healthy economies. The scale differed, but the philosophy was consistent. German prisoners who received dental care in 1944-45 watched the Marshall Plan unfold in 1948-51 with a sense of recognition. Of course they are doing this, Heinrich Becker wrote to a former fellow prisoner in 1949. This is what they do. They fix things. They rebuild. They invest in futures, even futures for former enemies. We saw it in the prison camps. Now we see it in our cities. The silver fillings were the first sign. The Marshall Plan is the same principle, just larger. Third, the dental program demonstrated the strategic value of soft power. American treatment of prisoners became known worldwide, publicized by the Red Cross, by returning prisoners, by journalists. This treatment contrasted sharply with Axis treatment of Allied prisoners. Japanese POW camps had death rates above 25%. German camps in the East were scenes of deliberate starvation and abuse. The contrast served American interests. It encouraged Axis soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. Why die for a losing cause when capture meant safety, food, and dental care? It bolstered American moral claims. We were the good guys, and here was proof in our treatment of enemies. It complicated Axis propaganda. How do you demonize an enemy who fixes prisoners' teeth? This strategic use of humane treatment wasn't cynical manipulation. Americans genuinely believed in these values, but the values also happened to serve strategic purposes. The best propaganda is truth, and the truth of American POW camps was powerful propaganda indeed. The legacy of wartime POW dental care extended far beyond the 1940s. It influenced American military medical doctrine, shaped veterans' memories and memoirs, and created small but meaningful connections between former enemies. In 1953, Klaus Steiner received a letter from the United States. It came from Captain, now retired Colonel, James Anderson, the dentist who had performed Steiner's root canal at Camp Ruston. Anderson was organizing a reunion of former camp medical staff and wondered if Steiner would like to attend if he ever visited the United States. Steiner, working as a clerk in Heidelberg, was stunned. The American remembered him. Not just remembered, but cared enough to track him down 8 years after the war's end. Steiner couldn't afford to travel to America, but he wrote back a long letter describing his life, thanking Anderson for the dental care and attempting to explain what it had meant. "You probably think you were just doing your job," Steiner wrote, "and you were. But your job saved more than my teeth. It saved my faith in humanity during a time when that faith was nearly destroyed. You showed me that enemies could treat each other with dignity, that professionalism and compassion could coexist with war, that Americans were not the barbarians our propaganda claimed, but civilized people who valued human life even when it wore an enemy uniform. I still have your fillings. They work perfectly. They remind me every day to judge nations not by their propaganda, but by their actions, especially their actions toward those they have power over." Anderson kept the letter until his death in 1987. His daughter found it among his papers and donated it to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where it remains in the archives, one small thread in the vast tapestry of war, reconciliation, and the surprising ways that dentistry intersected with history. Giuseppe Rossi's story had a similar epilogue. In 1965, traveling with his son on a business trip to Chicago, Rossi insisted on a detour to Wisconsin. They drove to the site of Camp McCoy, now transformed into a permanent military training facility. The POW barracks were gone, replaced by modern buildings, but the landscape was recognizable. Rossi stood in the parking lot where the dental clinic had been, now just empty pavement, and tried to explain to his son what this place had meant. "Here," he said, "I learned that the world was different than I believed. The fascists told us we were building a new Rome, that we were destined to rule. Here, in this camp, in that dental chair, I learned we were fools." The Americans had already built what we were pretending to build, a society wealthy enough to be generous, strong enough to be kind. When that dentist fixed my teeth, he didn't just give me the ability to chew, he gave me a future. He assumed I deserved a future. That assumption, from an enemy, was more powerful than any speech Mussolini ever gave. His son, born after the war, didn't fully understand. How could he? He hadn't lived through the transition from fascist certainty to American abundance, hadn't experienced the cognitive whiplash of discovering that everything you believed was wrong. But he took a photograph of his father standing there, and that photograph, showing an aging Italian man gesturing at empty pavement, explaining something invisible to everyone but himself, captured something essential about the war's psychological legacy. Takeshi Nakamura never visited America, but he followed American news closely for the rest of his life. The civil rights movement of the 1960s fascinated him. Here was proof that America struggled with its own contradictions, that the country wasn't perfect, that its treatment of its own minorities sometimes failed to match its treatment of enemy prisoners. This made America more comprehensible to him, more human. "They are not gods," he wrote in his diary in 1968 during the upheaval of that year. "They are people, flawed like all people, but they have systems that allow them to confront their flaws, to change, to improve." When that dentist fixed my teeth in 1945, he represented not American perfection, but American potential, the potential to turn abundance into generosity, power into mercy. Japan must find its own version of this. Not copy America, but learn the lesson that civilization is measured not by military strength, but by how we treat the powerless. Nakamura became a teacher after the war, teaching English and world history at a high school in Kyushu. He never explicitly told his students about his POW experience. That would have been culturally uncomfortable. But his lessons about America were shaped by those months in California. He taught his students to see beyond propaganda, to judge nations by their actions, to understand that defeat could be a teacher if you were willing to learn. One of his students, interviewed in 2003 for an oral history project, remembered, "Nakamura-sensei taught us about America differently than other teachers. He didn't present them as former enemies or current allies, but as complicated people with their own virtues and failures. He once said something I've never forgotten. Judge a civilization by what it does when it doesn't have to do anything, when it has power, and faces no consequences for using that power badly. That's when you see who they really are." I didn't understand at the time. Now I think he was talking about his own experience, though he never said so directly. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, a German historical society organized a conference on POW experiences. Klaus Steiner, now 73 years old, was invited to speak. He almost declined. Who wanted to hear an old man talk about dental work? But his grandson convinced him to attend. His presentation was brief, just 15 minutes, but it was received with surprising emotional intensity. Steiner spoke about the fillings, the root canal, the casual abundance of American dentistry. He spoke about what it meant to realize, while sitting in that dental chair, that Germany had lost not just a war, but a civilizational contest. He spoke about the 50 years since, carrying American dental work in his mouth like a small permanent reminder of lessons learned. "These fillings," he concluded, touching his jaw, "have outlasted the Third Reich, the Cold War, and my expectations of human decency. They are still here, still functional, probably still good for another decade if I live that long. When I die and they cremate my body, these silver fillings will survive. They will be small lumps of metal in the ashes, physically outlasting everything else. That seems appropriate. They represented a truth that outlasted lies, an abundance that outlasted scarcity, a humanity that outlasted hatred. The American dentist who placed them in 1945 probably never thought about them again, but I have thought about them every day for 50 years. They changed how I understood the world more than any battle, any surrender, any moment of the war, because they were proof, personal, undeniable proof, that everything we had been told about our enemies was wrong. The audience, many of them former prisoners themselves or children of prisoners, sat in silence. Then someone began applauding, then another. Within moments, the entire room was on its feet, not just applauding, but weeping, releasing emotions held for half a century. After the presentation, dozens of men approached Steiner. They had their own stories. The Italian prisoner whose dentures had allowed him to rebuild his life in post-war poverty. The German submariner whose dental work at a camp in Texas had been the first kindness he'd experienced in 3 years of war. The Japanese soldier who'd received treatment at a camp in Colorado and spent the rest of his life trying to reconcile American generosity with Japanese concepts of honor and shame. Each story was unique, but they shared a common thread: the profound psychological impact of receiving quality dental care from captors, the way this simple act of professional medical attention had undermined propaganda and reshaped worldviews. For these men, the dental chair had been a classroom where they learned lessons about power, civilization, and humanity that no other teacher could have conveyed. In 2005, the U.S. Army Dental Corps published a historical retrospective of its World War II activities. The section on POW care included statistics, photographs, and a few brief excerpts from prisoner testimonials. But it treated the subject matter-of-factly as routine professional activity that happened to involve enemy prisoners rather than American soldiers. This tone, competent professional, slightly oblivious to the profound impact of the work, was itself revealing. To American military dentists, they were just doing their jobs according to standard protocols. The fact that these protocols exceeded anything Axis prisoners had experienced wasn't something to brag about. It was simply how things were done. This gap between American casualness and prisoner astonishment defined the entire dynamic. Americans couldn't understand why prisoners were so shocked by basic dental care, because to Americans, it was basic. You fixed teeth that could be fixed. You used quality materials. You minimized pain. You treated patients, even enemy patients, with professional respect. These weren't extraordinary acts of mercy. They were normal operating procedure. But that normality, that systematic baking of generosity into standard protocols, was itself the most powerful testimony to American civilization's distinctive character. Other nations could be generous when feeling magnanimous. America systematized generosity, made it routine, embedded it in regulations and training manuals. The dental care wasn't an exception, it was the rule, and the rule revealed more than any exception ever could. Klaus Steiner died in 2001 at age 79. His grandson, the one who had convinced him to speak at the 1995 conference, was with him at the end. In the final week, as Steiner drifted in and out of consciousness, he touched his jaw repeatedly, a gesture he'd made thousands of times over 56 years, feeling for the fillings that had outlasted everything else. "Still there," he whispered once, smiling. "Still working. These American fillings last forever." After the cremation, the funeral director called the grandson. "There's something unusual," he said. "In the ashes. Small pieces of metal. They didn't burn." The grandson understood immediately. The silver fillings. He collected them, 3 small, misshapen lumps of amalgam that had survived not just decades in Klaus Steiner's mouth, but the final fire of cremation. They were pitted and discolored now, barely recognizable, but still identifiable as dental work by their characteristic shape. The grandson kept them in a small box, alongside his grandfather's war medals and a faded photograph from Camp Ruston. Sometimes he showed them to his own children, trying to explain what these small pieces of metal meant, why they mattered. The children, growing up in 21st century Germany, in a Europe long at peace. in a world where American abundance was taken for granted rather than astonishing, didn't really understand. "They're just old fillings, Papa," his daughter said once. "No," he replied, echoing his grandfather's words to him years before. "They are proof. Proof that the war was won not just with bombs and bullets, but with silver amalgam and Novocaine. Proof that America defeated its enemies by being so wealthy, so organized, so secure that it could afford to be generous. Proof that civilization is measured by what you do when you don't have to do anything at all. Your great-grandfather carried these fillings for 56 years, and they taught him something every day. Now they're teaching us, if we're willing to learn." The daughter looked at the small lumps of metal, trying to see what her father saw, what her great-grandfather had seen: history, evidence, testament, small silver monuments to the power of mundane decency, to the revolutionary impact of treating enemies like human beings, to the strange and unexpected ways that dentistry had helped win not just a war, but the peace that followed. "These fillings last forever," she repeated, understanding finally, feeling the weight of those words. Her father nodded, closed the box carefully, and put it back on the shelf where it would wait for the next generation, and the next, carrying its small but essential truth forward into a future that Klaus Steiner, sitting in that dental chair in 1945, couldn't have imagined, but had helped make possible by learning through silver and mercy what it meant to be defeated by a better idea of what civilization could be.